The autumn fog hung thick over St. Mary's Cemetery that October evening in 1918, when Private James Mitchell walked among the graves like a ghost searching for his own resting place. His boots, still caked with French mud, left dark prints on the wet grass as he moved between the weathered headstones. The church bells of Millbrook Village tolled 6 times in the distance, their bronze voices echoing off the limestone markers that stood like silent sentinels in the gathering dusk. James had been walking for 3 days since the train deposited him at Millbrook Station. 3 days of following familiar roads that somehow felt foreign, of recognizing landmarks that no longer recognized him. His left leg dragged slightly behind him, a souvenir from the Psalm that would mark his gait forever. His face, once full and boyish at 22, now carried the hollow-eyed gauntness of a man who had seen too much and eaten too little. He paused before a fresh grave, its earth still dark and recently turned. The marble headstone gleamed white against the gray evening, and James knelt to brush away the accumulation of fallen leaves. His fingers, trembling from exhaustion and something deeper than cold, traced the carved letters that spelled out a name he knew better than any other in the world. Private James Mitchell, beloved son and devoted fiancé. Killed in action, France, July 15, 1918. Greater love hath no man than this. James stared at his own name etched in stone, at the dates that declared his birth and death, at the epitaph that mourned a man who was very much alive and kneeling in the mud of his own grave. The church bells tolled again, 7 times now, as if counting the months he had been officially dead. If he was alive and standing there, then who was buried beneath that stone?
The journey home from France had taken James Mitchell 3 weeks, but the war had taken 3 years. 3 years of trenches that carved themselves into a man's soul deeper than any shovel could dig into earth. 3 years of watching boys from his own village disappear into mud and smoke, their letters home growing shorter until they stopped altogether. 3 years of learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The hospital ship from Le Havre had been crowded with men who wore their wounds like unwanted medals. James had shared a narrow bunk with a corporal from Manchester who wept in his sleep, calling for his mother. The man's left arm ended at the elbow, wrapped in bandages that smelled of carbolic acid and broken dreams. James had counted himself fortunate. His leg wound would heal, the doctors assured him. The fever that had kept him unconscious for 2 months in a field hospital near Amiens had broken. He would walk again, they said. He would go home. But home, it seemed, had already buried him. Village in mourning. The train from London to Millbrook had been filled with women dressed in mourning black, their faces pressed against windows as they searched the platforms at every stop. James had watched them count the returning soldiers, their lips moving silently as they matched faces to names on lists they carried folded in their gloves. At each station, some of these women would step off the train, their shoulders a little straighter, their pace a little quicker. Others would remain in their seats, the lists in their hands growing more worn with each mile traveled. Millbrook itself bore the scars of war as clearly as any battlefield, Black crape hung in shop windows like funeral shrouds. The market square, once bustling with farmers and merchants, now hosted memorial services and charity drives for widows and orphans. Every second house seemed to display a gold star in its window, marking another son who would never return from France. The pub where James had shared his last pint before leaving for war now displayed a wall of photographs, young faces frozen in time, their eyes bright with the optimism that had died with them in foreign soil. When James finally reached Millbrook Station, no one was waiting for him. The platform stood empty, except for old Mr. Henley, the station master, who looked at James as if he was seeing a spectre in broad daylight. Henley dropped the mailbag he was carrying, letters scattering across the wooden planks like leaves in an autumn wind. "James Mitchell," the old man had whispered, his voice barely audible above the steam hissing from the departing train. "But we buried you 4 months ago. Your parents, they got the telegraph."
Word of James's return spread through Millbrook's narrow streets faster than the evening fog. Mrs. Crawford, the baker's wife, crossed herself and muttered prayers in Latin when she saw him limping past her shop. Young Tommy Walsh, Henry's nephew, ran home screaming that he had seen a dead soldier walking through the village square. But not everyone reacted with fear. Old Ben Harper, who had lost 3 sons to the war, approached James with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He reached out with shaking hands to touch James's face, as if confirming that flesh and blood stood before him rather than spirit and shadow. "If you can come back," Harper whispered, his voice breaking, "maybe my boys can too. Maybe this whole bloody war has been one long nightmare, and we'll all wake up to find our sons sleeping safe in their beds." But Margaret Whitmore, Sarah's aunt, pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and declared loudly enough for half the village to hear, "The dead should stay buried. Nothing good comes from disturbing the natural order of things." The cottage where James had been born stood at the end of Elm Street, its thatched roof and whitewashed walls exactly as he remembered them. But black crape still hung in the windows, and the garden his mother had tended so lovingly showed signs of neglect. The gate creaked on hinges that needed oiling as James pushed it open and walked up the familiar stone path. He had knocked on the door he had never needed to knock on before, and waited. The footsteps inside were slow and heavy, the footsteps of people who had learned to move carefully through a world that held more sorrow than joy. When the door opened, his mother stood there, her hair gone completely grey in the 3 years since he had left. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes moving over his face as if she were trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. "No," she had said simply, her voice breaking on that single word. "No, I buried my son. I held his medal. I kissed his photograph. You cannot be him." His father had appeared behind her, his face harder than James remembered, aged by grief and loss. The man who had taught James to fish in the river behind their cottage, who had shown him how to tie knots that would hold against any storm,
now looked at his own son as if he were a stranger wearing a familiar mask. "Elizabeth," his father had said to his mother, his voice gentle but firm, "close the door. Whatever this is, whoever this is, our James is at rest in the churchyard." But James had seen something in his mother's eyes, a flicker of recognition that she was fighting against. He had spoken then, told them about the scar on his knee from falling out of the apple tree when he was 8, about the hiding place where he used to keep his pocket money behind the loose brick in the kitchen wall, about the night before he left for France, when his mother had packed his kit bag and whispered a prayer over each folded shirt. "Do you remember the song you used to sing when I couldn't sleep? The one about the sailor who sailed away but always found his way home by following the North Star." His mother's hand flew to her throat, and she stepped backward as if struck. She had sung that song to James every night during the terrible thunderstorms of his childhood, when lightning would crack across the Yorkshire sky and he would crawl into her bed seeking comfort. She had never sung it to anyone else, never even mentioned it to his father. It was their secret, their private ritual of love and protection. "How could you know that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. His mother had reached out then, her fingers stopping just short of touching his face. She had pulled her hand back as if his skin might burn her, as if touching him would make the impossible real. "If you are my James, then who did we bury? Who was in that coffin we carried to the grave? Whose body did we mourn?" It was a question that would haunt the cottage on Elm Street for the rest of that long October evening, and for many evenings to come. If James Mitchell was alive, then who had they buried? The news of James Mitchell's return spread through Millbrook like ripples on a pond, each circle of gossip growing wider and more distorted as it traveled. By the next morning, the entire village was caught between disbelief and wonder, between hope and fear. Some whispered that it was a miracle, that God had sent their lost son home. Others spoke in darker tones, suggesting that what had returned from France was not quite human, not quite the boy they had known. Dr. Harrison, who had delivered James into the world 25 years earlier, arrived at the cottage shortly after dawn. He was a man who believed in facts more than miracles, in medicine more than mystery. He examined James with the thoroughness of a scientist and the skepticism of a man who had signed too many death certificates in recent years. "Physically, he appears to be James Mitchell," the doctor told James's parents in the front parlor, his voice carrying the measured tones of professional authority. "The scar from his childhood appendectomy is present. His dental records, such as they are, appear consistent. The wound on his leg is healing properly and shows evidence of professional military medical care." But Dr. Harrison's clinical assessment could not explain away the mountain of official documentation that declared James Mitchell dead. The telegram from the War Office, dated July 20th, 1918, had arrived at the cottage bearing news that would shatter two hearts. "Regret to inform you that Private James Mitchell was killed in action on July 15th, 1918, during operations near Amiens."
The telegram was followed by a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, James's commanding officer, written in the careful script of a man accustomed to bearing bad news. The letter spoke of James's courage under fire, of his dedication to his fellow soldiers, of the way he had died, instantly, the colonel assured them, without suffering. The letter mentioned that James's personal effects would be forwarded home, along with his medals and a photograph found in his breast pocket. Those personal effects had arrived 3 weeks later: a pocket watch that had belonged to James's grandfather, a leather-bound Bible inscribed with his mother's handwriting, and a photograph of Sarah Whitmore, the girl he had promised to marry when the war ended. The watch had stopped at 11:43, frozen at the moment of its owner's death, or so everyone had believed.
Sarah Whitmore had worn black for 4 months. She had visited James's grave every Sunday after church, placing fresh flowers beneath the marble headstone and speaking to the earth as if the man she loved could hear her through 6 feet of soil and sorrow. She had written letters to him, letters she burned in her fireplace each evening because there was no address for the dead, no postal service that reached beyond the veil of mortality. In those letters, Sarah had told James about her life without him, about the empty space he had left in the world. She wrote about the mornings when she would wake expecting to find a letter from him on her nightstand, about the evenings when she would set 2 places at dinner before remembering that she would eat alone. She wrote about Henry Walsh, the banker's son who had begun calling on her in September, bringing flowers and careful condolences, and the gradual suggestion that life must continue for the living. Henry was a good man, Sarah had written in one of her burned letters to James. He was kind and patient and understanding about her grief. He didn't pressure her to put away her mourning clothes or to stop visiting the cemetery. He simply waited, offering quiet companionship and the promise of a future that didn't depend on miracles or resurrections. When Sarah learned of James's return, she had come to the cottage like a woman walking in her sleep. She stood in the doorway of the parlor, her face pale as winter moonlight, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white through the skin. She looked at James for a full minute without speaking, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't name. "You have a scar," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Above your left eyebrow, from when Tommy Fletcher threw that stone when we were children." James touched the small white line that marked his forehead, a scar so faint that most people never noticed it. "You remember that day." "I remember everything about you," Sarah replied, and then her voice broke. "That's why this is impossible. I remember the day they brought word of your death. I remember choosing the flowers for your funeral. I remember throwing dirt onto your coffin and hearing it strike the wood." She stepped backward toward the door, as if distance might make the impossible easier to bear. "I remember moving on. I remember accepting Henry Walsh's engagement last month because I couldn't spend the rest of my life loving a dead man." The engagement ring on Sarah's finger caught the afternoon light streaming through the cottage windows, a band of gold that represented a future built on the certainty of James's death. Now that certainty lay shattered like glass on a stone floor, cutting everyone who tried to pick up the pieces. That evening, Sarah sat in her own parlor across from Henry Walsh, the man she had promised to marry, the man who had offered her a life beyond grief.
Henry listened quietly as Sarah explained what she had seen, what she had heard, what she could no longer deny. His face remained composed, but his hands trembled slightly as he set down his teacup. "Do you love him?" Henry asked, his voice steady despite the pain Sarah could see in his eyes. "I never stopped loving him," Sarah admitted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Even when I agreed to marry you, even when I tried to build a new life, I never stopped loving him." Henry nodded slowly, reaching across the table to take the engagement ring from Sarah's finger. "Then we must discover the truth," he said simply. "And if James Mitchell has truly returned from the dead, then you must go to him. Love that survives death itself is not something to be ignored."
But the most troubling questions centered on the funeral itself, a ceremony that had drawn mourners from 3 neighboring villages. The Reverend Marcus Fuller had conducted the service in St. Mary's Church, the same church where James had been baptized as an infant, where his parents had been married, where generations of Mitchells had marked the milestones of their lives. The church had been packed that July morning, filled with villagers who had known James since childhood, with soldiers who had served alongside him, with families who had lost their own sons to the same terrible war. The air had been thick with the scent of lilies and roses, flowers that had wilted in the summer heat as if they too were mourning. The coffin had been draped with the Union Jack and carried by 6 soldiers from the local garrison, men who moved with military precision despite the tears that streamed down their faces. They had served with James, had shared trenches and rations and fears with him. To them, he was not just another casualty of war, but a brother who had died far from home. Reverend Fuller had spoken about sacrifice and service, about young men who had given their lives so that others might live in freedom. He had read from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted." His voice had broken when he reached the passage about a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. The funeral procession to St. Mary's Cemetery had been led by a military band that played the last post with haunting precision. The sound of the bugle had echoed off the stone walls of the church and the cottages lining the street, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of all the young lives that had been lost in France. Villagers had lined the route, men removing their hats, women dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs, children standing solemnly beside their parents as history passed before them. At the graveside, James' mother had been given the folded flag that had covered the coffin. She had held it against her chest as if it contained the essence of her lost son, as if its folds might somehow bring him back to her. The military honor guard had fired 3 volleys into the summer sky, the sharp crack of rifles echoing across the cemetery like the sound of thunder before a storm. But no one had seen the body. Military regulations, they were told, prohibited opening coffins that had traveled from the battlefield.
The journey from France to England was difficult enough without subjecting grieving families to sights that would haunt them forever. Better to remember their loved ones as they had lived, not as war had left them.
As the days passed and James's presence in Millbrook became undeniable, questions began to multiply faster than answers. Children playing in the streets would stop their games to stare at him, their young faces filled with the kind of frank curiosity that adults had learned to disguise. They whispered among themselves, calling him the dead soldier and the ghost man, titles that followed him through the village like unwanted shadows. Margaret Whitmore, Sarah's stern aunt, had taken it upon herself to voice the suspicions that others were afraid to speak aloud. She cornered James outside the post office on his third day home, her eyes blazing with righteous indignation. "If you are truly James Mitchell," she declared, her voice loud enough to attract attention from passers-by, "then explain why you were found alone in that French field while your patrol mates disappeared without a trace. Explain why you survived when better men than you died. Explain why God would choose to send back one man when so many mothers pray for their son's return." James had no answers for Margaret Whitmore, just as he had no answers for the doubts that plagued his own mind. Why had he lived when others died? What quirk of fate or divine intervention had spared him from the grave that had claimed so many of his friends? The questions followed him through his waking hours and haunted his dreams, mixing with the memories of gunfire and screams that the war had burned into his mind. Even his parents began to show signs of strain. James would catch them watching him when they thought he wasn't looking, studying his face as if trying to convince themselves that he was truly their son. At dinner, conversations would stop abruptly when he entered the room. At night, he would hear them talking behind closed doors, their voices carrying the weight of questions they were afraid to ask aloud. The breaking point came when James found his mother going through his belongings, examining each item with the intensity of a detective searching for clues. She held his grandfather's pocket watch in her hands, the same watch that had been returned with the official notification of his death. "This watch stopped at 11:43, she said, without looking at him. "That's what the letter said. It stopped at the moment you died." James took the watch from her hands and wound it carefully, the familiar ticking resuming its steady rhythm. "It started again when I wound it in the hospital, Mother. Time doesn't stop for the living, only for the dead." But her mother's eyes were filled with tears, and her voice shook when she spoke. "Then tell me, James, if you are my son, if you truly survived that battle, then who is buried in your grave? Who was in that coffin we lowered into the earth? Whose death have we been mourning all these months?" The brass button James had found at his graveside seemed to whisper a truth that no one was ready to face. James's search for answers led him first to the families of his missing patrol mates, men whose names had been relegated to the bureaucratic limbo of missing in action, presumed dead.
Each visit was a journey into grief that mirrored his own family's pain, but with the cruel difference that these families had no body to bury, no grave to visit, no final ceremony to mark the end of their hopes. Mrs. Hayes lived in a narrow house on the outskirts of Millbrook, a woman worn thin by factory work and grief. When James knocked on her door, she opened it with the weary expression of someone who had learned not to expect good news from unexpected visitors. Her face, marked by lines of worry and sleepless nights, suddenly transformed when she saw the figure standing on her doorstep. "William," she whispered when she saw James standing on her doorstep. For a moment, her face lit with impossible hope. "William, is that you?" But the hope faded quickly as she looked more closely at James's features, recognizing them as belonging to someone else's son. "You're James Mitchell," she said, her voice flat with disappointment. "They said you were dead." "They said your William was dead too," James replied gently. "But I was with him on that patrol. I was there when we were attacked." Mrs. Hayes invited him into her small parlor, where a shrine to her lost son occupied the mantelpiece. William's photograph smiled down at them from a silver frame, surrounded by his medals, his letters home, and a small vase that held fresh flowers despite the 4 months that had passed since his death was reported. The room told the story of a mother's devotion. School certificates carefully preserved behind glass, a football trophy from William's youth, a packet of letters tied with blue ribbon that represented 3 years of correspondence from France. On a small table near the window sat William's last letter home, written just days before the fatal patrol, in which he had expressed hope that the war would end soon and he could return to help his mother with the struggling household. "Tell me about my boy," Mrs. Hayes said, her hands folded in her lap like a prayer. "Tell me how he died." But that was the problem. James couldn't remember how William Hayes had died, because James himself had been unconscious for most of the events that followed the German attack. His memories of that night were fragmented, broken by the fever and trauma that had kept him in a field hospital for 2 months. He remembered the whistle of incoming shells, the rattle of machine gun fire, the screams of wounded men. He remembered falling, remembered pain shooting through his leg, remembered darkness closing over him like water over a drowning man. James described what he could remember: William's steady presence during the mission briefing, his quiet joke about the French countryside, reminding him of the Yorkshire Dales, his careful check of his rifle and equipment before they set out into no man's land. But the crucial moments, the moments when life and death were decided, remained lost in the fog of trauma and unconsciousness. The visit to Robert Crawford's family was equally heartbreaking. Robert's parents had received word of their son's presumed death, but no body had been recovered, no burial had been arranged. They continued to hope, against all evidence, that Robert might somehow return from the missing. His room remained exactly as he had left it, his clothes folded in drawers, his books arranged on shelves, his bed made with military precision as if he might walk through the door any moment. "We keep expecting him to come home," Robert's mother had said, her voice carrying the desperate edge of hope fighting against reality. When we heard about your return, we wondered if perhaps the others might come back too." The mystery deepened with the arrival of Captain Reynolds, a military investigator who came to Millbrook 3 days after James's appearance in the village. Reynolds was a thin, precise man with the demeanor of an accountant and the authority of someone accustomed to finding discrepancies in official records. He had been sent by the War Office to investigate what officials were diplomatically calling irregularities in casualty reporting. Captain Reynolds interviewed James in the cottage parlor, his notebook open, his pen poised to record every detail. The questions came in systematic waves. Details about the patrol mission, descriptions of the other soldiers involved, recollections of the battle that had supposedly claimed James's life. The War Office has certain concerns about irregularities in casualty reporting, Captain Reynolds explained, his voice carrying the measured tones of official authority. "Your case is not unique, Mr. Mitchell. The chaos of the Western Front created numerous administrative errors, cases where the wrong names were attached to the wrong bodies, where missing soldiers were declared dead and dead soldiers were listed as missing." But as the interview progressed, Reynolds' questions took on a more sinister tone. He asked about James's whereabouts during the 2 months between the battle and his appearance at the field hospital. He inquired about the circumstances of his rescue, about the French farmer who had supposedly found him, about the medical records that documented his recovery. "I'm not suggesting that's what happened in your case," Reynolds was careful to add, but his eyes remained fixed on James's face as he spoke. "However, the irregularities in the records require thorough investigation. There have been cases, rare cases but documented cases, of soldiers who deliberately exchanged identities with fallen comrades. Deserters who took the names of dead men, cowards who let others die in their place, men who chose to disappear rather than face the court-martials that awaited them." The implications of Reynolds' words settled over James like a shroud. If he couldn't prove his identity conclusively, if the military authorities decided that he was an impostor who had stolen a dead man's name, he could face charges of desertion, fraud, or worse. The very fact of his survival had become suspicious. His return from the dead transformed from miracle to potential crime. Reynolds' investigation extended beyond James himself to include interviews with family members, friends, and neighbors. He questioned Dr. Harrison about the medical examination, Reverend Fuller about the funeral service, even old Mr. Henley about James's arrival at the train station. Each conversation added another layer of scrutiny, another level of doubt about the impossible truth of James's return. The pressure of investigation and suspicion began to weigh on James's relationship with his community. Neighbors who had initially welcomed his return now whispered about the strangeness of his survival,
about the coincidence of his appearance just as questions were being raised about military records. The children who had called him the dead soldier now avoided him entirely, running away when he approached and hiding behind their mother's skirts when he passed on the street. The pub where James had once been welcomed as a local boy made good now fell silent when he entered. Conversations would stop mid-sentence, glasses would pause halfway to lips, and the warm camaraderie that had once defined village life would freeze into uncomfortable silence. The landlord, Tom Brewster, would serve James his pint with professional courtesy, but none of the warmth he had once shown to the boy who had grown up in the village. Even the church became a place of exile. During Sunday service, the pew where the Mitchell family had sat for generations remained empty, except for James's parents, who had resumed attending despite the whispers and stares of their neighbors. James himself stopped going to church after Reverend Fuller approached him with gentle but pointed questions about the state of his soul and the circumstances of his miraculous return. "God works in mysterious ways," the Reverend had said, his voice carrying both comfort and warning. "But we must be certain that what appears to be divine intervention is not something more earthly in nature. The devil, they say, can appear as an angel of light." The isolation was most painful in his relationship with Sarah. She had broken her engagement to Henry Walsh, returning his ring with quiet dignity and genuine regret for the pain she was causing. But her freedom to love James again was complicated by the questions that surrounded his identity, the suspicions that tainted his return from death. They would meet in secret now, walking together along the river path where they had once planned their future, talking in hushed voices about the impossibility of their situation. Sarah believed that James was truly himself. Her heart recognized him even when her mind struggled with the logical impossibility of his survival. But belief and certainty were different things, and the doubt that surrounded James like a cloud also cast shadows over their rekindled love. The investigation took a crucial turn when Captain Reynolds focused his attention on the personal effects that had been returned to James's family after his reported death. The items, the pocket watch, the Bible, and Sarah's photograph had been the primary evidence of James's death, the tangible proof that he had perished in that shell-torn field near Hamel. James's grandfather's pocket watch became a particular point of scrutiny. The watch, a silver timepiece engraved with the initials TM for Thomas Mitchell, had been in the family for 3 generations. It had been carried by James's grandfather during the Crimean War, by his father during the Boer War, and by James himself to France. The watch had supposedly stopped at 11:43 on July 15, 1918, marking the precise moment of James's death. But when Captain Reynolds examined the watch more closely, he discovered something troubling. The mechanism showed signs of recent maintenance, work that had been done after the supposed date of James's death. The hands had been moved, the crystal replaced, and the internal springs adjusted. Someone had repaired the watch, someone with access to precise tools and considerable skill in clockwork. "This watch has been serviced within the last 2 months," Reynolds informed James during another tense interview. "The work was done by a professional, someone with extensive knowledge of timepiece repair. The question is, who performed this maintenance and why?"
The mystery deepened when Reynolds discovered that the photograph of Sarah, found in James's uniform, had also been tampered with. Close examination revealed that the photograph had been removed from its frame and replaced, leaving tiny scratches around the edges where it had been handled. Someone had taken great care to ensure that these personal effects would be found with the body, but they had made mistakes that only detailed investigation could reveal. Even more damning was the discovery that the leather Bible, inscribed with his mother's handwriting, contained a prayer card that had been added after the book's return from France. The card, printed on paper available only in England, had been carefully aged to match the rest of the book's contents. But chemical analysis revealed that the aging had been artificially induced, suggesting deliberate deception rather than natural wear.
As the evidence mounted against him, James found himself trapped between the impossibility of proving his identity and the growing certainty that someone had deliberately arranged for his death to be reported. The personal effects that should have been proof of his identity were instead evidence of an elaborate deception. But who had orchestrated this deception, and why? The answer came from an unexpected source, a brass button that James had found half buried near his gravestone. The button, which he had carried with him since his first visit to the cemetery, bore the insignia of his regiment, but showed subtle differences from the standard-issue buttons on his own uniform. Captain Reynolds, examining the button under magnification, discovered something that changed the entire investigation. The button bore a maker's mark that indicated it had been manufactured in a different factory than the buttons on James's uniform. More importantly, the serial number stamped into the brass corresponded to a batch that had been issued to replacement soldiers in late 1917, months after James had received his original equipment. This button belonged to someone else, Reynolds concluded, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. Someone who joined your unit after you had already been equipped and deployed. Someone who was wearing this uniform when they died in your place. The implications were staggering. If someone else had been wearing James's identification when they died, if someone else had been buried under James's name, then the entire mystery began to make sense. But who was this unknown soldier, and how had his death become confused with James's life? The only way to answer these questions, the only way to prove James's innocence and solve the mystery of his own death, was to open the grave and examine what lay within. The truth, whatever it might be, lay buried beneath 6 feet of English earth and 4 months of official certainty. But as James stood in the cottage kitchen holding the brass button that had become the key to solving an impossible puzzle, he realized that some truths came at a terrible price. Opening his own grave meant confronting not just the mystery of who had died in his place, but the even more troubling question of why someone had chosen to save his life at the cost of their own. The only way forward was to open his own grave.
The exhumation was arranged for dawn on November 1st, 1918, exactly 2 weeks before the armistice would end the war that had claimed so many lives. Captain Reynolds had obtained the necessary authorizations from both military and civilian authorities, though the process had required delicate negotiations with church officials who were reluctant to disturb what they considered consecrated ground. James stood beside his own grave as the gravediggers worked, their shovels biting into earth that had been packed down by 4 months of rain and settling. The November morning was cold and still, the kind of dawn that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of revelation. A thin layer of frost covered the grass and headstones, making the cemetery look like a battlefield where winter had claimed victory over autumn. His parents stood nearby, their faces gray with exhaustion and dread. His mother clutched her husband's arm with both hands, her knuckles white with tension, her eyes fixed on the growing pile of dark earth beside the grave. She had aged years in the weeks since James's return, the strain of questioning everything she thought she knew about life and death and the nature of miracles. Dr. Harrison was present to examine whatever remains might be found, his medical bag at the ready, his expression professionally neutral, despite the extraordinary circumstances. But James could see the physician's hands trembling slightly as he arranged his instruments, betraying the nervousness that his controlled demeanor tried to hide. Captain Reynolds supervised the operation with military precision, consulting his pocket watch and making notes in a leather-bound journal. He had brought a photographer to document the proceedings, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, who set up his equipment with the solemn efficiency of someone accustomed to recording history in its darkest moments. The Reverend Fuller offered prayers for the departed soul, whoever that soul might be, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. Even Sarah Whitmore had come, standing at a distance but close enough to witness the resolution of the mystery that had torn their lives apart. She wore black again, not in mourning for James, but in respect for the unknown dead man whose sacrifice was about to be revealed. A small crowd of villagers had gathered beyond the cemetery walls, drawn by curiosity and the human need to witness moments when the impossible becomes real. They spoke in hushed whispers, their breath visible in small clouds in the cold air, their faces reflecting the mixture of fascination and fear that accompanies encounters with mysteries beyond normal understanding.
As the shovels struck wood, James felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever lay in that coffin would determine not just his identity, but his future. If the remains were identified as someone else, he would be vindicated, his survival proven miraculous rather than fraudulent. If the coffin contained evidence that pointed to his own death, he would face charges that could destroy everything he had hoped to reclaim. The coffin, when finally exposed, showed the effects of its time in the earth. The mahogany had darkened and warped slightly, and moisture had seeped into the joints despite the craftsman's best efforts. But it remained sealed, its brass fittings tarnished but intact. The Union Jack that had covered it during the funeral service now replaced by the damp soil of St. Mary's Cemetery. Dr. Harrison descended into the grave with the careful movements of a man approaching a medical examination that would change lives. He worked to open the coffin with respectful efficiency, his tools designed for precision rather than speed. The brass screws that held the lid in place had corroded slightly, requiring patient work to remove without damaging the wood or disturbing what lay within. When the lid finally lifted, everyone present leaned forward to see what 4 months of burial had revealed. The November morning seemed to grow quieter, as if even the wind was holding its breath in anticipation of truth. The remains were more preserved than anyone had expected, the cool English earth having slowed the natural processes of decay. But what struck James immediately was not the condition of the body, but the uniform it wore. The tunic was indeed that of his regiment, bearing the same insignia he had worn into battle. But there were differences, subtle differences, that only someone intimately familiar with military dress would notice. The brass buttons on the tunic were not standard issue. They bore slight variations in design that marked them as replacements, probably salvaged from other damaged uniforms. The boots were a size too large for the feet that wore them, stuffed with newspaper to provide a better fit. Most telling of all, the dog tags around the corpse's neck were not the original stamped metal that had been issued to James Mitchell.
Dr. Harrison's examination revealed more discrepancies that painted a picture of deliberate deception overlaying genuine tragedy. The body showed evidence of wounds that James did not carry, a healed fracture in the left wrist that had occurred months before death, dental work that did not match James's medical records from his Army physical examination, and most conclusively, a distinctive birthmark on the right shoulder that James did not possess. "The skeletal structure is wrong," Dr. Harrison announced to the assembled witnesses, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. "This man was shorter than James Mitchell by at least 2 inches. The bone density suggests someone older, perhaps 28 or 30 years of age rather than 25. The dental records show extensive repair work consistent with poor nutrition in childhood, work that was never performed on James Mitchell." But the most significant discovery came when Dr. Harrison found evidence of the wound that had killed this unknown soldier. A rifle bullet had shattered the man's left femur, causing massive internal bleeding that would have been fatal within minutes. The wound was consistent with the type of injury that German machine guns inflicted on advancing infantry, but it was not the leg wound that James carried from his own battle experience. Captain Reynolds documented each discovery with meticulous care, his photographer recording evidence that would be crucial for the official report. But even as the medical facts accumulated, the human mystery deepened. Who was this man who had died wearing James Mitchell's identity? Why had he been carrying James's personal effects? How had his death become confused with James's survival? The definitive answer came when Dr. Harrison discovered a personal item that had been overlooked by those who had prepared the body for burial. Sewn into the lining of the tunic's breast pocket, hidden so carefully that it had escaped notice during the initial processing, was a small piece of folded paper. The paper was water-stained and fragile, but the writing on it was still legible. It was a letter, written in pencil, on paper torn from a field notebook. The handwriting was shaky, suggesting it had been written under difficult circumstances, possibly by candlelight in a trench or shell hole. The letter was addressed to "My dear mother," but contained a revelation that made everyone present understand the magnitude of what had transpired in that French battlefield 4 months earlier. The letter was signed with a name that made everything clear: "Your loving son, Thomas Brennan." James remembered Thomas Brennan, the orphaned corporal, who had been part of their ill-fated patrol. Brennan had been a quiet man, older than the others, who had joined the army at 16
by lying about his age. He had served for 8 years, making the military his family, and his fellow soldiers his brothers. He had no family to write to, no one to mourn him, no one to miss him when he failed to return from patrol. But this letter, written in what Brennan must have known were his final moments, revealed a secret that he had carried throughout his military service. Thomas Brennan was not an orphan. Somewhere in Ireland, a woman named Bridget Brennan waited for news of the son she had given birth to in poverty and shame, the son she had been forced to surrender to the workhouse when he was barely 6 years old.
Captain Reynolds read the letter aloud to the assembled witnesses, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. My dear mother, though I do not know if you remember me or if these words will ever find you, I write them because I am dying and I want someone to know that I never forgot you. I am Thomas Brennan, born in County Cork in 1888, the son you gave to the workhouse when times were hard and choices were few. I have served 8 years in His Majesty's Army, and I have tried to make you proud, even though you could not know of my efforts. I am writing this in a shell hole in France, with German bullets flying over my head and my own blood soaking into foreign soil. I am going to do something that may seem wrong, but I believe it is right. James Mitchell lies unconscious beside me, wounded and burning with fever. He has a family who loves him, a girl who waits for him, a future worth preserving. I have nothing but this uniform and these boots, and neither will matter when I am gone. I will give him my chance to live and take his chance to die. I am switching our identification, Mother. When they find us, they will think that James Mitchell died and Thomas Brennan disappeared. But it will be the other way around. I will die under his name so that he can live under mine, at least long enough to reach help. If anyone ever reads this letter, tell them that Thomas Brennan chose to die so that another man might live. Tell them that an orphan boy from Cork found something worth dying for in a shell hole in France. And if by some miracle this reaches you, Mother, know that your son's last thoughts were of you, and that he died believing he had finally done something that might make you proud. Your loving son, Thomas Brennan.
The letter revealed the truth of what had happened on that terrible night near Hamel. Brennan had found James wounded and unconscious, his leg shattered by shrapnel, his body burning with fever. The German patrol that had attacked them was still searching the area, and Brennan knew that neither of them would survive if they remained where they were. Brennan had made a decision that would echo through the decades that followed. He had switched their identification tags, placing his own dog tags around James's neck and taking James's tags for himself. He had given James his own tunic, the one with the non-standard buttons and the loose fit. Then he had attempted to carry James to safety, knowing that the effort would likely cost him his life. Brennan had died during that journey, succumbed to his own wounds while trying to save a man he barely knew. When the French farmer found James hours later, he had been wearing Brennan's uniform and carrying Brennan's identification. The farmer had assumed that the delirious soldier was Thomas Brennan and had reported him as such to the British medical authorities.
Meanwhile, Brennan's body had been discovered by the search party, wearing James's dog tags and carrying James's personal effects. The condition of the corpse had made visual identification impossible, so the searchers had relied on the physical evidence of identity. James Mitchell was declared dead, and Thomas Brennan was listed as missing, when in fact the opposite was true. "He saved my life twice," James said, his voice breaking as the full magnitude of Brennan's sacrifice became clear. "Once when he carried me toward help, and again when he took my death upon himself. Thomas Brennan died so that I could live, and then he died again when we buried him under my name." Thomas Brennan had died twice, once in the mud of France, and once in the official records that erased his name from history.
The exhumation of Thomas Brennan's remains marked the end of James Mitchell's ordeal, but it was also the beginning of a different kind of responsibility. Captain Reynolds closed his investigation immediately, his report concluding that Private James Mitchell had been the victim of a case of mistaken identity caused by the heroic actions of a dying comrade. There would be no charges, no court-martial, no questions about desertion or fraud. James Mitchell was officially alive, and Thomas Brennan was officially dead, 4 months after the truth should have been recorded. But as James stood beside the open grave, looking down at the remains of the man who had died twice for his sake, he understood that some debts could never be repaid, some sacrifices could never be adequately honored. Thomas Brennan had given James Mitchell not just his life, but his death, and in doing so had created a mystery that would echo through the lives of everyone who had been touched by it. The village of Millbrook slowly accepted the truth of James's return, though the supernatural nature of his resurrection would become part of local folklore for generations. Children would be told the story of the soldier who came back from his own grave, and adults would use it as proof that miracles, however rare, still occurred in a world that had grown dark with war and loss.
Sarah Whitmore never fully recovered from the shock of losing James and then finding him again. The experience had taught her that love was not just about holding on, but about letting go when necessary and accepting what returned when it was freely given. Their wedding was a quiet affair, attended by family and close friends who understood that they were witnessing not just the union of two people, but the celebration of love that had survived death itself. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, and James wore his dress uniform, the same uniform he had worn when he left for France 4 years earlier, now bearing the weight of experiences that had transformed the boy who had departed into the man who had returned. Sarah bore James 3 children, and each one was told the story of Uncle Thomas, the soldier who had given their father a second chance at life. The children grew up understanding that their existence was a gift made possible by a man they had never met, a debt of gratitude that would be passed down through generations of the Mitchell family.
James Mitchell lived to be 87 years old, but he never forgot the debt he owed to a man who had no family to remember him. The marble headstone in St. Mary's Cemetery was changed, the carved letters carefully altered to read Corporal Thomas Brennan, died July 15, 1918, in service to his brother-in-arms. Below that, James had added an inscription of his own choosing. He died twice, so that another might live once. Every year on July 15th, James would visit Brennan's grave, bringing fresh flowers and spending an hour in silent conversation with the man who had given him everything. He would tell Brennan about his life, about his marriage to Sarah, about the children they raised, about the small victories and ordinary joys that Brennan's sacrifice had made possible. James became a teacher at the village school, dedicating himself to educating the children of Millbrook with the same devotion that Brennan had shown to his fellow soldiers. When his own sons asked about the war, James would tell them not about glory or heroism, but about the quiet courage of ordinary men who chose to sacrifice for others. More importantly, James established a scholarship in Thomas Brennan's name, funded by his teacher's modest salary and designed to help orphaned children receive the education that Brennan himself had never had the chance to complete.
The scholarship continued long after James's death, administered by his children and grandchildren, ensuring that Brennan's name would be remembered not just as a casualty of war, but as a source of hope for future generations. On his deathbed in 1983, James Mitchell's final words were reported by his eldest son to be a whispered, "Thank you, Thomas. I hope I made it count." The village of Millbrook, which had grown from a small farming community into a modest market town, still maintains Thomas Brennan's grave. A brass plaque near the headstone tells the story of his sacrifice, ensuring that his name will not be forgotten as long as the cemetery stands. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Thomas Brennan was not carved in marble or cast in bronze. It was the life that James Mitchell lived, a life of service, dedication, and quiet heroism that honored the memory of a man who had chosen to die so that another might live. In the end, Thomas Brennan had achieved a kind of immortality, not through his own survival, but through the survival of someone else. The pocket watch that had belonged to James's grandfather became a family heirloom, passed down through generations, along with the story of the man who had wound it again after it had stopped. But more than an object, it became a symbol of time reclaimed, of life given as a gift by someone who had chosen to surrender his own future so that another's could continue. Some men died twice in the Great War, once in the trenches and once in the memories of those who loved them. But Thomas Brennan achieved something rarer still. He died once, but lived twice. First in his own sacrifice, and then in the life he had saved. And perhaps that is the greatest victory any soldier can win, not to defeat death, but to transform it into something larger than itself, something that creates life rather than ending it. In the end, James Mitchell's return from the dead was not a miracle of resurrection, but a testament to the power of human sacrifice. Thomas Brennan had given not just his life, but his very identity, so that love might triumph over loss and hope might survive despair. It was a gift that could never be repaid, only honored through a life lived in service to others, a debt that James Mitchell spent 65 years trying to fulfill.